Thanks, Rachel, and thanks to ODI and SLRC for inviting us. What I'm going to do is just to try to take a bit of a wider view and draw a couple of implications building on what Robert and George were talking about, focusing a bit on general trends in development assistance to fragile states and conflict areas, and a little bit about what the Asia Foundation is doing. I should say that the Asia Foundation, for those of you who don't know us, we work in 18 countries in Asia. 7 of those countries are affected by violent conflict. We are a partner with DFID under their PPA program, and our work under that program is focused entirely on state-society relations in conflict areas and fragile states. And so this topic is obviously very relevant for us. We've been trying to use surveys systematically in the way that we are working on issues around governance, as well as how we monitor our programs in these areas. And so we'll draw a little bit of that experience in today. Let me begin with a couple of observations. First, just a simple one that I think many of you have already thought about, that there seems to be a pretty clear tension between the Fragile States Agenda and the mandate for empirically driven ODA. Clearly, there's been a number of important commitments over the last couple of years to raise the level of credibility of evidence, so we know that we're actually having an impact on the ground, and DFID has obviously been an important part of that. At the same time, there's a reaffirmation of commitments to fragile states. We often hear from DFID that 21 of their 28 bilateral countries is in a fragile state. They're not alone. AusAid, for example, is 53% of their aid is going to fragile states or conflict-affected areas. USAID is similar, so this is a broad trend. But it raises, obviously, a dilemma. We know from experience that these areas are notoriously challenging to monitor impact, to gather data, and to really understand what's going on. In addition, the WDR last year and various other studies have told us that if we really want to understand the dynamics of fragility and conflict, we need to ask a lot of questions that are inherently difficult to measure, and certainly they're very difficult to measure on a quantitative basis. These political and governance dimensions are simply not easily quantified. But also, I would argue that there's a worrying gap that we're seeing between project-level results monitoring and real change on the ground. So, for example, if you look at Afghanistan, if you look at all the different project evaluations, well, you know, you'd think Afghanistan would look a lot better than it does. But in reality, there's a disconnect because measuring project-level outcomes does not tell you that much about how things are actually changing on the ground. And we have to understand that disconnect. So, similarly, in this context, we have to realize that it's becoming very, very hard to produce the evidence that's increasingly expected in terms of how we're working on fragility and conflict. So in this period where there's increasing pressure to justify aid programs, this is leading to a couple of things. It's leading to intense scrutiny of aid programs in fragile and conflict areas, as well as increasing expectations that will all improve the way that we collect data so that we can prove the fact that we're having impact. So this leads to 2 broad questions in my mind. One is, what's the future of the Fragile States Agenda? And 2, how can we shape both of these agendas in such a way to allow for rigorous evidence-based monitoring that is realistic and meaningful given the constraints in a fragile state in the conflict area? So let me reflect a little bit on those 2 questions. It's clear, I think, that perception surveys are a large part of the answer, or could be a part of the answer. The WDR last year, I think, did a good job of putting its finger on the fact that surveys in conflict areas are a very valuable and underutilized tool for understanding dynamics in conflict areas. And I think also there's a broader evolution of thinking about what are these problems that are dogging us in conflict areas. 2 key insights have emerged. I think there's broad consensus around. One, simply that state capacity and service provision are not the only factors that determine violence levels, determine the level of fragility. In fact, they probably aren't even the most important factors. Second, that political factors and the public perceptions of authority and legitimacy are actually much more important drivers of conflict and fragility. And so these two insights, I think, are really driving us to look more seriously at perception surveys. I mean, the Asia Foundation's experience with surveys really goes back about 12 years. We began mostly focusing on voter surveys in various contexts, in conflict and non-conflict. Over the last 5 years, we've increasingly found that most of our surveys are being done in conflict-affected areas and fragile states. In fact, the majority of them are now. This is Nepal, Sri Lanka, southern Philippines, southern Thailand, Pakistan, East Timor, and obviously Afghanistan. So we found actually that surveys are a particularly powerful tool in conflict areas for both influencing the policy debates as well as for informing our programs and monitoring our programs. So perception surveys help us to measure things that are very fuzzy and difficult to understand, like state-society relations and political dynamics and the legitimacy of state and non-state actors. Arguably, within the area of state building and peace building, a lot of us have been guilty of making pretty sweeping generalizations not based on evidence. For example, the assumption that improving services leads to increased state legitimacy and to reductions in violence, a huge assumption that we have not had very good evidence to prove. Also, that the assumption that state capacity or presence to provide security and justice in remote areas or in restive areas is welcomed by that population. These are big assumptions that we really need to dig into, and perception surveys help us to do that. Arguably, yes, perception surveys are not the only approach. We need to take mixed methods approaches, and TAF usually uses mixed methods as much as we can. And there's a lot of debates about what can we really draw from perception surveys. But I would argue that the lack of data on these issues has been a major stumbling block to understanding the dynamics, as well as to raising the profile of these issues within the policy debate about what we should be doing in fragile states. So I think this is a gap that really needs to be addressed very soon. Now, probably more troublingly, I would say that the weak evidence base also leads us to go into a lot of things blind and make a lot of mistakes that we could have avoided if we had had a better sense of what's happening on the ground. Let me draw on two examples of this, or two scenarios. One is local level conflict dynamics. Now, from the outside, many outsiders, many international development practitioners and donors assume some degree of homogeneity within a conflict area. For example, Mindanao in the southern Philippines. Well, it's a violent, probably a dangerous place. In the past, we haven't done a very good job of trying to unpack the local dynamics. But in fact, as we've done more studies and more perception surveys in these areas, we've realized that there's extreme variation within local conditions with important implications for aid programs. We often call this sort of conflict microclimates. The conditions in one valley may be completely different from the next valley or between hamlets. And understanding this could be very important. I use the Mindanao case because there's a good example there of this playing out. The World Bank has community-driven development programs across the Philippines, including in the most conflict-affected areas. A study came out 2 years ago that showed that in some areas, the introduction of a CDD program actually led to a short-term increase in violence. But in other areas, it had the opposite effect. And as you dug in a bit more to understand what the differences were, the insurgent groups who were predominant in those areas had different political incentives. One side was threatened by that. The other side actually had an interest in increasing prosperity in their area, and so they welcomed it. A second area is what we would call troubled state-society relations, and there's important implications about this for working through country systems and working with central governments. I think increasingly we found that political alliances and ethnic and religious identity are critical determinants of perceptions of government. And that there's big variation between different parts of countries on their relationship with government. And it's often based on local identity and local politics. Governments are often controlled by particular factions, particular circles of elites that have links with certain parts of the population, and they tend to channel aid and the benefits of the state to those populations, creating winners and losers and alienating parts of the state, parts of the population. So without understanding these dynamics, we go into regions not realizing that, for example, helping to strengthen state capacity in a certain area could actually make things worse. And so these are some of the areas I think that we need to understand a bit better. George mentioned before some of the different areas that TAF uses perception surveys. Let me just emphasize one point. We use these primarily as program tools. Programs, for example, in southern Thailand to draw out the grievances of the population in the Deep South towards the government, so as to inform government policy and inform our programs. We use these, for example, to understand perceptions of the police in order to work with the police and communities to improve their performance in conflict areas. So the vast majority of the surveys we have done have had actually a program implication. Only in the last couple of years have we actually tried to start using them to monitor our programs. And there's a reason for that. It's a challenge. We're a very relatively small organization. It's hard to make a plausible case that our modest interventions are having macro level impacts, which is what surveys are designed to capture. However, if you're looking at a donor level or even at a sort of a portfolio level with multiple donors, it's much more plausible that the introduction of aid programs could have macro level impacts that can only be tracked or can very effectively be tracked by perception surveys. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities to track results monitoring through perception surveys going forward. So in conclusion, just 3 points. One, I think that I would hope that we would come away from this discussion with the assumption that perception surveys are a necessary part of working in conflict-affected and fragile areas. But it's a very challenging endeavor. But the question is not whether we should do them or not, but just let's figure out how to do them better and more systematically and raise the credibility of the results that we're finding. Similarly, we have to recognize that in these very, very challenging environments, that we're going to need a different burden of proof in terms of the evidence that we're collecting. We can't hold programs and the evidence base in these areas to the same standard that other sectors or other areas are held to. Similarly, if we're looking at issues about conflict and fragility, governance, state-society relations, we're not going to reach the same level of rigor as we would for health and education programs, for example. So we need to recognize that there's got to be a different burden of proof, but that there is absolutely a need to improve the evidence base beyond what we have now. And this is actually sort of an area for really urgent need. And then finally, that perception surveys are just one tool to address this broader dilemma that we need to look at. And we need to look at other tools that go along with that. So thank you.